This is the ongoing series in which I attempt to work through the entire Game Boy library, 3 games at a time. In each episode, I'll talk about one game that I like, and one game that I don't. And finally a third mystery game that might be good or it might be bad. The only thing I can say for sure is that it will certainly be Game Boy. This is the good, the bad, and the Game Boy. As a video game loving kid of the 80s, it was easy to convince me that the one thing I wanted more than anything else in the world was a portable Nintendo that I can sneak into school in my backpack. And the credit for planting this idea in my tiny, undeveloped child mind goes not to Nintendo, but to Tiger Electronics. I had a bunch of these stupid things, most of which were at least marketed as portable versions of my favorite NES titles. Sadly, the excitement of being able to theoretically play games like Double Dragon and Mega Man 2 during the car ride to Grandma's house ran headlong into the reality that actually playing these games on a Tiger handheld was only marginally more entertaining than trying to spell out naughty words on a calculator.
Video excitement in the palm of your hand.
Still, the market was there, and when Nintendo launched the Game Boy in 1989, it was received very well. So well, in fact, that Nintendo quickly established a death grip on the handheld video game market that its competitors couldn't loosen even with technically superior hardware and viciously passive-aggressive marketing.
If you were colorblind and had an IQ less than 12, then you wouldn't care which portable you had. Of course, you wouldn't care if you drank from the toilet either.
Oddly enough, it seems like the only competitor who was able to stand toe-to-toe with Nintendo during those days was Tiger, in their relentless Zerg rush of shitty licensed LCD games. I mean, I had 6 or 7 of these things when I was a kid. How many did you have? Conversely, how many Atari Lynxes did you or your friends have? Anyway, when you're hosting the biggest party on the block, everyone wants to come enjoy the festivities. It wasn't long before all the recognizable franchises from the NES began appearing on the Game Boy, and by the end of 1991, that included my absolute favorite NES character, Mega Man. Mega Man in Dr. Wily's Revenge was developed by Minakuchi Engineering, a company who would continue to work with Capcom on many Mega Man titles. Known as Rockman World in Japan, this game was kind of a side story to the core Mega Man series on the NES. While it mainly focused on the original Mega Man game, it also borrowed many assets and ideas from Mega Man 2. Also, it's worth mentioning that the American box art was pulled directly from Mega Man 3's cover, which showed a very elfish-looking Mega Man shooting Sparkman right in the dick. The method of Dr. Wily's titular revenge is a little half-baked compared to his episodic schemes from the NES games. Instead of crafting 8 new robot masters to challenge Mega Man, Wily resurrects 4 robots from the first game: Cutman, Electman, Iceman, and Fireman. The omission of the iconic Gutsman and my personal favorite Bombman is unfortunate, but it seems like the selection of robots was likely based on the utility of the sub-weapons you get from them. And let's be real, as great as Gutsman and Bombman were, their weapons were honestly among the very worst in the entire series. Wily has also resurrected 4 robots from Mega Man 2, Quickman, Flashman, Heatman, and Bubbleman, although they only appear as boss fights towards the end of the game. And lastly, there's a 9th robot called Anchor, a new boss character unique to the game and acting as kind of a secondary boss before the final showdown with Dr. Wily. It would be easy enough to dismiss Dr. Wily's Revenge as a simple port of Mega Man 1. But all of the stages in the game are entirely original, and there's plenty of unique elements sprinkled throughout the game to give Mega Man's first Game Boy adventure a distinct identity over the NES series. Graphically, the game looks excellent. Character sprites are perfect pixel-to-pixel duplicates of their NES counterparts. The music is also fantastic. The subtly reworked themes from the original game sound great, and there's a handful of truly banging original themes as well. But I think it's time I address the elephant in the room. The elephant in this case, of course, being Mega Man himself. Mega Man is enormous in this game. The Game Boy screen was a little over half the size of the video output of the NES, and by that I don't mean the size as in inches, I mean the number of pixels that were being displayed on the screen. The NES screen was, I think, 256 by 240 pixels, whereas the Game Boy was just 160 by 144. On the NES, character sprites typically fell into the 8 to 10% range in relation to the overall screen size. Some characters were taller and wider than others, but generally they were all about 8% as wide as the game screen and about 10% as tall, give or take. So when developers brought their popular NES titles to the Game Boy, they had to make a choice. Do they sacrifice character detail by shrinking the sprite down to more closely match the console's character-to-screen ratio? Or do they keep the character NES accurate at the expense of valuable real estate on the Game Boy screen? Mega Man went the latter route. His sprite takes up about 13% of the horizontal size of the Game Boy screen and about 17% of the vertical, except even that isn't accurate. There's this big bar at the bottom of the screen that displays all the health and energy gauges, which cuts down the vertical size of the playable game screen by another 16 pixels, pushing that vertical percentage up to nearly 20%. So Mega Man appears approximately twice as tall on the Game Boy screen as he does on the NES. This creates a very cramped environment where there's very little room separating Mega Man from the enemy characters, the stage hazards, and the basic geometry of the stages. They did try to compensate for this a little bit by decreasing the height of his jump and his movement speed. Although, to be fair, the reduced running speed was also to compensate for the notorious motion blur of the Game Boy screen. However, even these concessions create their own problems. Mega Man, as a result of all these changes, feels a lot more sluggish on the Game Boy. And the reduced jump height means that it's now just that much harder to avoid boss characters who are also, I should add, the exact same size as their NES counterparts. Now, I'm spending so much time on this because Dr. Wily's Revenge is generally seen as a very difficult game. And this is why. The challenge comes not from tricky or malicious game design, it's because of how the game actually works. But in spite of all that, Mega Man's first outing on the Game Boy is an excellent game. One of my very favorites, in fact. Its flaws aren't exactly small. It's understandable that they would be deal breakers for a lot of people. But the fact that it received 4 sequels means that enough people were able to overlook these flaws that it remained a lucrative series for Capcom long into the Game Boy's lifespan, and would account for some of the most beloved games in the system's library. Unfortunately, it would get a lot worse before it got better. Just a few months after Dr. Wily's Revenge released in the US, we received its first sequel, and I was really excited about this one. While Dr. Wily's Revenge did borrow some assets from Mega Man 2, it was mainly focused on the original Mega Man game, which at the time I didn't really have much of a connection to. The sequel, however, would take assets from Mega Man 2 and 3, both of which I owned and loved. Now, just like Mega Man 2 did on the NES, Mega Man 2 on the Game Boy would build upon the basic structure of the first game and pretty much establish the format that all future games would follow. Mega Man would first fight through 4 robots from one of the NES games. In this case, it would be Crash Man, Metal Man, Airman, and Woodman from Mega Man 2. After a brief Dr. Wily stage, Mega Man would then face another quartet of bosses from the next game in the NES series, which were, in this game, Needleman, Magnet Man, Hardman, and Top Man from Mega Man 3. In the previous game, the second wave of robots only appeared as boss fights, but now they would each appear at the end of a full stage. And as with Dr. Wily's Revenge, a wholly original 9th robot acted as the game's secondary antagonist, which in Mega Man 2 is Quint, a reprogrammed version of Mega Man from the future. And upon defeating him, Mega Man would then enter the final Dr. Wily stage, which took place in a different base than the one that Mega Man visited in the game's halfway point. Now, on paper, it sounded amazing. Not only did it focus on my 2 favorite games from the NES series, it would also address my chief complaint with Dr. Wily's Revenge by giving proper stages to the second wave of boss robots. And then I played the game. So until recently, the cutting room floor, one of my go-to resources for video game information, reported that Mega Man 2 was developed for Capcom by a company called Japan System House. I guess some new information has come to light because now they are crediting a company called Thinking Rabbit, who are responsible for 8 Eyes on the NES and the Sokoban games, which I know as Boxel on the Game Boy. In either case, Mega Man 2 was developed by a smaller studio with very few hits under their belt, and who apparently weren't very familiar with the Mega Man series. And it showed. Possibly in response to the complaints about the first game's difficulty, Mega Man 2 makes a number of adjustments. The most obvious is the weird and ugly miniaturization of all the character sprites. Now, on its face, I don't think this is a bad idea. I think this is probably what they should have done in the first place. There's not a lot of room on the Game Boy screen, so smaller characters means more room to work with. That's pretty easy math. Nintendo themselves, with Super Mario Land, set a pretty good example of how a game can be shrunken down to a very comfortable and playable degree and still be immediately recognizable. The issue is that the sprites in Mega Man 2 weren't shrunken down in a very consistent way. Most of the characters had just a few lines of pixels removed, giving them a strange, almost chibi appearance. Mid-boss character sprites are abbreviated even further, which looks even more ridiculous when appearing on screen with the same NES-accurate Mega Man sprite from Dr. Wily's Revenge. When Mega Man himself is the only character who has not been adjusted down to fit the Game Boy screen, it kind of makes it look like he's been pulled into some weird Lilliputian dimension where everything is a fraction its normal size. Take a look at Dr. Wily in the final fight here. Can you see him? He's the pair of eyes that you can barely see peering over the controls of this dinosaur mech. But as ugly and visually inconsistent as these new graphics are, the most important point I can make, and I can't stress this enough, is that for better or worse, this is not how the first game did it, and I don't like it when things are different. And as long as we're on the subject of doing things different, Mega Man 2 does not reuse the music from the original games, as Dr. Wily's Revenge did. It replaces all those classic stage themes from Mega Man 2 and 3 with original music tracks. And while the compositions of these new themes isn't completely terrible, the music itself is ear-piercingly high-pitched and extremely unpleasant to listen to. And even if this wasn't the case, I still don't understand what they were hoping to accomplish here. Did they really think they could come up with better music than what we had in Mega Man 2 and 3, which are, years later, still regarded as some of the best soundtracks in the entire series? And adding to this are the number of other equally odd design choices, like the out-of-place sound effects, or the way levels continue scrolling into the boss hallway. I mean, that's not right, that's not how Mega Man works. They also couldn't figure out how to make the sub-weapons deplete the gauges completely, so you can effectively run out of ammo while still having unused bars in the energy gauge. And even with the shrunken down sprites, the stages still somehow feel more cramped and crowded than they did in Dr. Wily's Revenge. Quint's character design is lame, and his weapon is stupid. I don't even know how to use this thing without taking damage. But you know what, it ultimately doesn't matter, because in spite of all these issues, Mega Man 2 is entirely toothless. And not in a fun, breezy kind of way like Mega Man 6 was, but in a, dear God, I totally wasted my allowance money on this game kind of way. The whole game feels clumsy, and derpy, and amateurish, and extremely, aggressively un-Mega Man-like. So congratulations Capcom and Thinking Rabbit or Japan System House, whoever. Together you created one of the very worst Mega Man games ever made. I hope you're proud of yourselves. Well, I think that's more than enough Mega Man games for one video, so let's go in a different direction for the third game. Alien vs. Predator. Now I want to believe that this game will be good, but I do have my doubts. I usually do try to thematically link all three games in these videos, even if some of those connections are a little dubious sometimes. But I didn't really give much thought to this one, other than the fact that Capcom had made an arcade game with the same name. But hold up, don't get too excited. Capcom had nothing to do with this game, and this game has nothing to do with that arcade game. So I ended up talking about Mega Man a little longer than expected, big shock there, so I'm going to get straight to the point on this one. This game kinda sucks. It does have some mechanics I like though. If you've ever played Power Blade on the NES, this game superficially functions the same way, except nowhere near as good. As the Predator, you work your way through a series of non-linear levels, picking up a variety of semi-optional weapons and items along the way. As you would expect, the levels are crawling with all the typical forms of xenomorph morphology. You have the facehuggers, the snake-like alien larvae, and of course the fully grown alien soldiers. Out of the gate you can defend yourself with your arm blades, but you can also pick up a laser shot which homes in on whatever alien the game decides is the closest one to you, which is not always the one you're actually trying to shoot, by the way, or the death frisbee from Predator 2. The most critical item to find is definitely the bomb, which doesn't really seem to be very useful against enemies, but it can break through brick walls blocking your path, and can even launch you into the air so you can reach places that are too high for your normal jump. The main item you're looking for in every stage though is a key, which unlocks the door leading to the stage exit. As you explore the stage, a map gets drawn up here in the upper left, which also shows enemies moving around in your vicinity. The map requires energy to operate, however. If you run out of power, the entire map disappears and you're basically left running blind. So be sure to grab any extra batteries you see laying around. Alien vs Predator encourages exploration, but it punishes you for lingering in the stages for too long. It's incredibly tempting to try to fill out that map at the top of the screen, but frequent dead ends means that you waste a lot of time backtracking. Enemies respawn infinitely, and they're often placed in such a way that taking damage is practically unavoidable, like dropping down on you when you're climbing up ladders, and they're almost always waiting for you at the bottom of blind jumps. To make matters worse, you are completely helpless unless your feet are on the ground. You can't attack while jumping or climbing a ladder, and enemies are eager to capitalize on this. Every time you die, you restart from scratch at the very beginning of the stage. Considering how slowly your character moves and how cheaply the enemies steal away your hit points, it's not long before the game starts feeling monotonous and tedious. As frustration sets in, however, remember you can always find solace in the funky way the Predator shakes his booty as he's climbing up ladders.
Video excitement in the palm of your hand.
And that's 3 more games down, and still many, many more to go. In the next episode, we'll look at 3 more games, but in the meantime, thank you for watching The Good, The Bad, and the Game Boy.